Hi there, it's Friday, March 20th, 2026, and this is Washington in Focus Daily. I'm Carleen Johnson, the Center Square state government reporter. And in today's episode, the wait is on to find out when Governor Ferguson is going to sign the income tax bill. He's given no indication that he won't, but today he is in Yakima signing several GOP-backed bills that did pass during the legislative session. No indication again that he was going to sign the income tax. It was not on his calendar of bills to be signed into law today. Could come up at any time. He could even sign over the weekend when he's kind of hoping there'll be less media attention. We're doing everything we can to stay on top of this. The Washington Center for Housing Studies, though, in the meantime, has come out with a report in conjunction with the Building Industry Association of Washington that suggests our state wouldn't need an income tax and could actually generate plenty of revenue for state coffers just by opening up the home building gates. The suggestion is that expanding housing supply can address the need for additional state revenue more effectively than new income based taxation. And then simultaneously, of course, that would address what we have as a critical housing shortage in the state of Washington. So we're going to have some of that for you. And along those same lines, concerning the housing shortage, Senator Jeff Wilson of Longview, he finally got a bill through this year to allow kit home builds. He tells us this is one small but significant solution to address the housing crisis. These are like back in the Sears and Roebuck catalog days when you could order up a kit home and it shows up at your front door and you can build it over the weekend. A solution, possibly making the cost of housing more affordable for many first-time home buyers. So we'll see what he has to say about that. Then my colleague Tim Clauser of Spokane, that city there is projecting a potential multi-million-dollar deficit for 2027 and 2028, the biennium, threatening to follow recent severe budget shortfalls. And the question is, are more taxes the solution? Seems like that's always the solution of government. So Tim will share his thoughts on that. And then again, we're still waiting to find out if Governor Ferguson is going to opt the state of Washington and Washington taxpayers into the new federal education income tax program. This allows a federal income tax break on returns of up to $1,700 that can then be directed into educational programs in the K through 12 system. 30 states apparently have opted in already. We have until the first of the year to decide. Washington has not yet opted in. So what's the holdup? We've reached out to the governor, and then we have some comments on this from Vicki Murray, who is the director of the Center for Education at Washington Policy Center. So no signing yet on the income tax as we dive in. A week since it arrived on the desk of Governor Bob Ferguson, the so-called millionaire's tax for just shy of 10% tax on income above $1 million or combined household income above that threshold. So this is pretty interesting. How about instead of implementing an income tax in Washington, we unleash Washington's housing productivity and let that be part of the revenue solution. And at the same time, of course, that would address the critical housing shortage that we have. That is the suggestion coming from the Building Industry Association of Washington and the Washington Center for Housing Studies. They ran the numbers and found that building 20,000 additional homes annually could generate about $600 million in state revenue. That's about a quarter of the projected first-year revenue from the proposed income tax. So it's not going to bring in all of the money from the income tax that's projected to come, depending on how many wealthy people pick up and leave and relocate their businesses elsewhere to avoid the tax. But this is, potentially a real piece of the solution if we can unleash that building capacity. So I spoke today with Jan Heimbaugh, Executive Director of External Affairs for the Building Industry Association of Washington.
I mean, I think everyone admits that we have a housing crisis, and that means, right, homes are too expensive. people can't access them, and there's not enough of them, and they're too expensive because there's not enough of them. And we have consistently said that from no matter what your sort of political bent is, everyone has acknowledged that there is some sort of housing crisis. And the State Department of Commerce also has said we need to build this many houses by, 1 million houses by 2030. We're not going to be anywhere close to that. But we were sitting over here at BIW as they were discussing the income taxes and like the need for consistent long-term stable revenue, the quote unquote need, right? It's another sort of debatable thing, but like let's accept that premise. And routinely we put out a report that historically we've been like the amount of tax revenue that is generated from new home construction for the state and local governments is a lot every year. And it's sustainable in a way too, because you're also then improving property values, and those properties are long-term stable funding for state and local government tax receipts. So we were just thinking like, well, if we built more houses, I wonder if this would solve part of what we are calling a budget crisis or a budget need or a budget gap. And turns out, yeah, it would make a significant impact. And I think how we budget here and how the state approaches tax revenue is exactly the opposite of what it should be. Instead of sort of spurring economic development, I mean, if we built 20,000 more houses annually, right, we're getting to a quarter of the revenue of what they anticipate the income tax is going to generate. If we built, in the houses that we actually needed, we could probably cover that income tax. But like, that's just the housing. That's just housing. What if we actually, allowed for people to do other businesses too? What kind of tax revenue are those generating? And how are we looking for opportunities to encourage businesses and encourage economic growth here? For things like increased property tax, sustainable property tax revenue. You get someone to move into a home, they're living and working in their community, they're paying sales tax, they're paying property tax. Those things are all multipliers on a stable funding source for our state, instead of sort of the very volatile income tax.
So Jan explained that, when you get someone moved into a home, they're living there, they're working in that community, and they're paying sales tax, they're paying property tax, and those things are all multipliers, right? For stable funding for the state, instead of this more volatile income tax. And the income tax, she said, is going to hurt a lot of their own members, people who are not uber wealthy at all. These are the guys with, smaller, medium-sized construction companies in the state. She said it's going to hit those folks because they're not taking home $1 million in income for the year, but just the amount of cash that you have to have on hand to even start to build one house, let alone a subdivision or a multifamily complex, an apartment complex, that requires a lot of capital. So at times you're going to have an account that shows a heck of a lot of that capital, makes you look like a millionaire, even though that's not the case. Those folks, she says, a lot of her builders are already telling her, we operate a little bit in Washington, a little bit in Idaho, a little bit in Arizona. We're going to up and probably do all of our future building in another state to avoid not only the income tax that's coming here, but all the other burdensome taxes and regulations on builders. All right, and keeping with the housing theme, a bill passed in the Washington legislature this year, and it was signed by Governor Bob Ferguson, that could mean some new options for housing in this state and really help out a lot of potentially first-time homebuyers or people looking to downsize and avoid out-of-control property taxes. The bill's primary sponsor is State Senator Jeff Wilson of Longview, and this is his Kit Homes bill, which directs the State Building Code Council to develop some rules specifically for kit homes. These are 800 square feet and smaller. So depending on how big of a house you live in, that might seem really small, or that might seem really doable, depending on where you are in life and how many kids you may have still at home. But remember, before World War II, it was not uncommon to buy one of these kit homes. You literally had pre-cut lumber, all the accompanying materials, all the instructions. Now we've got YouTube, but back then it was a thick catalog with the instructions from Sears and Roebuck, and you literally ordered your home by mail. Maybe your parents or grandparents did something like that years ago. Well, given the housing shortage and given the high cost of building and property taxes in the state of Washington, this is something that Senator Wilson has been working on again for a couple of years. And this year finally saw that bill through.
Who on earth has $600,000 for a junky starter home? So the kid home is a natural extension of a menu. It's not my idea. Sears and Roebuck beat me to it 100 years ago. You could order something out of a catalog, and this little pallets would show up, and there's your house. I didn't want to get greedy. There was a reason I set it at 800 square foot and residential, because I didn't want people to think, oh, now we're having three stories and fire escapes and basements. I needed to keep it simple. But listen, we got to acknowledge there's a crisis, but we have to really take action. What are you doing about it? And listen, if this is going to be an affordable form of housing, and you can even do it yourself, Carly, we could put up a house in an afternoon, you and I, and be proud of what we've done, and we can own it in a reasonable amount of time or pay cash for it. We should have did this 4 years ago. But I am a state senator. I had to get in line. I have had to take all the suffering and torture. But we're finally got it fast tracked, and I'm ready to rock and roll. My hyperactivity, believe me, was going to be demonstrated when I do the follow-up bills to the kid home bill, because quite frankly, 800 square foot, I live in a 1,200 square foot mobile home. I don't have to have a mansion with servants' quarters and this. I need something that I can afford so that I have a warm, dry place to stay. And hopefully, because of its value, it also sends a message to the tax assessors. Don't be telling me my kid home is going to be worth, $600,000. It sets a new market range for the way we even do property taxes, because they're going to drive by. Well, it's still an 800 square foot. No reason to, the way they assess the property and the market, this one will actually be probably the best value going into that process over the years.
So Senator Wilson teased me that he's going to have some additional legislation coming up in the 2027 session that kind of builds on the whole kit home idea. And he's very optimistic about some of the other solutions for the housing shortage. Okay, so second segment here, Spokane is projecting a multi-million-dollar deficit for the 2027-28 biennium, and that threatens to follow recent severe budget shortfalls. Now, the city closed a $13 million gap for this year, for 2026, through some tax hikes and some personnel cuts. They did let some employees in city government go, but given inflation, rising costs for business, rising employee costs, they're fearful that, yes, maybe it's going to have to require some more taxes to balance the budget. So I got a chance to chat with Center Square's Eastern Washington reporter, Tim Clauser, to go over the details. So I'm the Center Square state government reporter, Carleen Johnson. Along with me today, our Eastern Washington reporter, Tim Clauser, who has been diving along with members of the council this week into Spokane's budget. Apparently, we didn't do too bad in 2025. Looking ahead, are we in for more taxes later this year and certainly into the next biennium budget for 27 and 28? Because apparently we're already looking at some deficits. So Tim, unpack this for us. What do the latest numbers show for 2025, and then looking ahead for the rest of this year and into the following couple of years?
Yeah, so from the time Mayor Lisa Brown took office in early 2024, she knew that she was walking into a tough budget situation that she mainly blamed on the prior administration's budgeting practices. But going into 2025, they were focused on balancing a $25 million deficit. They did that going into 2025. Then into 2026, they had another $13 million deficit. But budgets are kind of a living, breathing document. So going back to 2025, We just wrapped that up a few months ago, but the city hasn't finalized its books yet, much like the rest of the state. So they're not sure quite how the numbers are going to end, but they said that early in 2025, they noticed that sales tax growth was the most volatile that it's ever been for 2025 compared to prior years. So usually when they look at sales tax growth, which is where much of their revenue comes from, you see like constant gains. So usually they would say, we're going to look at 2, 3, 4% annually. And that's sat pretty consistent. They said with 2025, it was pretty alarming because in some months you would see that 2 or 3% increase in sales tax growth, but then in other months it would plummet and be negative. So it made it hard to plan ahead. And in response, the city kind of pulled back on spending. So that kept them within their means. They're saying by the time they finalize the 2025 books, they do expect maybe a slight surplus. And I'm saying slight, very slight. But if not a slight surplus, they expect the books to come out balanced. But at the same time, with the books being balanced, they still looking ahead to 2026 before we entered this year. They knew there was a $13 million deficit because of rising costs, expanding spending. And they balance that by making cuts, passing a new parking tax and such. But it doesn't solve their problems going forward. Every year with inflation rising, it's going to tighten their belts. So right now, inflation on average rises about 3% annually. Last year, they ended up with sales tax growth year over year at about 0.7%. They had budgeted 2%. So that sales tax revenue is coming in far below inflation. So really, they're just not getting as much bang for their buck. And what does that do for the future? It likely means that they're going to end in another budget deficit ahead of next year that they'll have to solve going into the 2027 to 2028 biennium.
And you mentioned them kind of realizing, early into 2025, the sales tax revenue wasn't coming in what they expected. Maybe it's because people are so heavily taxed. We just don't have income to go make those high dollar purchases on many items. But they reined in spending for different city agencies, county agencies, maybe didn't take as many trips or that kind of a thing. What did they do to sort of rein in government spending? Because as you and I well know, and you've written about this extensively, that is so much of a huge cost of government is the employees and their benefits.
Mhm. Yeah, you're right. They did pull back discretional spending. They didn't go into too much detail during the budget meeting on Thursday, but they did pull back discretionary spending, and I'm sure that wherever there was vacancies, they likely eliminated those or held off on filling those because it's been said in Spokane and a lot of other cities around the state. Generally, with salaries and benefits, it makes up about 80% of the budget. So it's easy to say, hey, let's go in, let's cut these things, let's cut spending on this. But really, it comes down to headcount. So they said that they did pull back on spending to stay within their means, but that just balanced things for the time being. You have these collective bargaining agreements, which is the union negotiations for these people saying that, year over year, you're going to get X amount of raise, 2, 3%, however much it's set at. But the city is obligated to give those raises. So next year, you're going to see those salaries increase, and that's going to increase the city's spending. And they have to come up with a way to pay those wages, or they have to get rid of, say, non-exempt employees. So it's likely we're facing another deficit ahead of 2027. Last year, last July, they had given budget projections showing that there could be somewhat of a $20 million deficit in 2027 and then a $25 to $30 million deficit in 2028. And they're on a biennium budget, a 2-year budget. So that would be a cumulative budget of $50 million or so. And I asked the city council about this, council member Michael Cathcart. He's the only conservative left on the dais. He said they don't have a firm projection yet. They are looking at getting that 6-year general fund forecast out by July, a little bit later than they were expecting. They were hoping by May. It doesn't look like that's going to happen. But he said from conversations that he's had with the council's budget director, they are looking at somewhat of a $20 million deficit ahead of next year. And in the past, they have made cuts, but they have also turned to taxes the last 2 years to help fill that budget deficit. And with him only being a one-person minority on the council, he doesn't have much room to push back and said there are options for them to raise taxes, whether it be on the ballot or councilmanically for next year. But he's hoping that they just tighten their belts and batten down. And his suggestion was, instead of saying, let's budget for 2% sales tax growth, or even lower than that, why not budget 0%? Say our
Well,
revenues
never
are
gonna
not going
get
to grow at
nothing, then
all.
be happy and spend more if you get more than you thought you were gonna get.
Yeah, yeah.
It's kinda like how you and I have to budget, right? I mean, it's nice as city, county employees that they can literally bank on that cost of living increase every year because they are public employees. Of course, it doesn't work that way in the private sector. If things aren't going well for private companies, nobody's getting a raise, but in government, it never works that way. I mean, Tim, I know you didn't get into it this much in the article up at the Center Square Washington's page on the budgeting this week on that, but I was wondering if you have any sense, just anecdotally from your previous coverage, the homeless situation in Spokane. It's been something you've written extensively about, and I wonder how much of a drain on city and county resources might play into that. Um, Maybe not any discussion in this budget on Thursday, but that's gotta be a continued strain on the budget.
Yeah, yeah, and just to clarify, this is just the city's budget. The county has faced
Okay.
its own budget woes, but we're talking about the city here. And yeah, homelessness in mitigating that crisis, it does play an impact on the budget. But I will say at the same time, uh, they spend tens of millions of dollars on homelessness every year in Spokane, but much of that comes from the state and federal government grants from them. And that's not to say that that's not our tax dollars. That's tax dollars that we're paying,
Right.
but it's not so much the local taxes that Spokane is raising. They're not say, raising taxes to cover these homelessness expenses. Although one could argue that, say, the public safety sales tax does go towards mitigating homelessness in a sense. But they do spend a few $1 million on it. I wouldn't say it's such a substantial amount of their budget that it's pulling them down. But I think the situation in Spokane is that there's not quite an appetite to batten down and make the real difficult decisions. When it comes down to balancing a budget, if you want to say, let's cap our revenues where they're at and live within our means, there's inevitable consequences that come with that, and that usually means cutting headcount, and that can be a difficult thing to do and unpopular on both sides of the aisle. If you come and say you fire 20 people, that's 20 people who aren't taking a check home to feed their families. But that's not to say that the city shouldn't be living within their means. They have to get to a point where they have to say, well, are we going to increase taxes substantially, or are we going to cut substantially? And going into 2025, when they were facing that $20 million deficit, they put this sales tax measure on the ballot that gave them about $7 million, and it kind of delayed some of those more consequential cuts that they would have to make. But prior to putting that, the mayor had proposed this massive property tax increase that she said would solve the city's $25 million deficit on its own. But at the same time, it would raise the cost of living substantially for property owners. And when she proposed this, she basically said, look, if you guys don't pass this, our budget's going to stay in this unsustainable position, and we might have to fire dozens of police officers.
Of
And
course,
so
they
it's kind
immediately
of a big trade off
they
there.
go immediately to the public safety thing, even though that's supposed to be outside of education priority number one. That's always if you don't let us raise taxes, we have to fire all the cops. I mean, that is just such an old and tiresome
Yeah.
argument. And and of course that makes people freak out and they go, okay, sure, raise my taxes. I don't want to lose my officer. It's
That's what whether it be police officers or city council staffers, it inevitably comes back down to headcount, though. So I think that's likely an argument that we'll see heading into budget negotiations later this year is the council willing to make some of those bigger cuts to, say, staffing across the city, or are they more so willing to delay the more consequential cuts that they'll have to make down the road if they don't make them this year?
mm. And I think if you ask the average Spokane taxpayer, and maybe took a big poll of people and said, okay, are you willing to, you know, cut back a little on city staff versus lose a couple of police officers, you're probably going to get folks that want to support the police and maybe forgo a couple of city staffers. But
Yeah, and I will step in right here. So Greater Spokane Incorporated, it's essentially the regional chamber of commerce for Spokane. It does these. I think it's a quarterly poll that it does to taxpayers, looking at do you feel safe going downtown during the day and at night? What's working with the city? What's not working with the city? Do you prefer living in unincorporated county in the city or in Spokane Valley? And one of the questions that they asked last fall was, do you think that the city is making enough in terms of tax dollars? And do you think that they're spending it efficiently? And the majority of people in the survey last fall said, yes, we do think that the city is making more than enough in terms of taxes, and they are not spending it efficiently. So it's a clear sign from the taxpayers that uh, they're not really happy with the rising cost of living over the last few years, and they would like the council to do more in terms of spending that money efficiently and making sure it goes farther and
Mm,
that they get the bang for their buck.
Well, that's exactly it. We're all paying more and more and more in taxes. And yet, quality of life, cost of living, uh, ability to feel safe, as you mentioned, going downtown to the local grocery store, we see that we're not getting the bang for the buck. So I think that's interesting that finding in Spokane. Well, second largest city in the whole state, massive population there. So thank you for paying attention to it and staying on top of it. And if you want to check out Tim's story, I encourage you to go to thecentersquare.com/Washington. And thank you for joining us today, Tim. Appreciate all your work on this important topic. Thanks for watching this episode of Washington in Focus. So you can check out Tim's story on this at thecentersquare.com/Washington. And finally, as the wait continues to find out if Governor Ferguson is going to opt Washington into a federal education tax credit, more and more other states across the country are opting in. This is where you get a $1,700 tax credit on your federal income tax return and then can direct that money then to education priorities in the state of your choosing. Anything in K through 12. You can opt into putting your $1,700, say, towards tutoring. Say you want to put it, you've got, your child went to a particular private school or public school, or particular extracurricular program that you believe a lot in, you can direct the money there. It's completely up to the taxpayer who gets the credit on their income tax, the federal income tax return, and then can direct the money. The issue is Governor Ferguson has to opt us into that program. So Vicki Murray is Washington Policy Center's Education Center Director. She has some very strong feelings about this program.
When you hear scholarship, you think, oh, private school. No, it's for public district and public charter schools, for every regular sort of K-12 education expense you could imagine: transportation, supplies, computers, special education, therapies, tutoring, uniforms if you have uniforms. So all of those sorts of expenses, these scholarships would cover. And here's the great news for Washington taxpayers. For every federal taxpayer here in Washington, you make a donation of up to $1,700, you will get a dollar for dollar credit, not a deduction, a dollar for dollar credit off your federal income tax bill, just for making donations to nonprofits that raise money for these K-12 expense scholarships. So imagine if you're a charter school consortium, the State Board for Charter Schools. Wouldn't it be wonderful to set up your own scholarship granting organization, nonprofit, and fundraise and help pay for these sorts of things? And you don't have to be held hostage, by Olympia to do it. If just 30% of us Washington federal income taxpayers participate in the program, that's over $700 million annually for our schools and students here in Washington. If Governor Ferguson does not opt us in, though, guess where that money's going? It's going to go to Idaho. It's going to go to Montana. It's going to go to Wyoming. We could send it to Mississippi. They're doing amazing things. We could send it to Kentucky. We could send it to any of those 30 states and growing that are participating in the program.
So you heard Murray with Washington Policy Center say, again, it's more than $700 million in education funding, potential of that for the state of Washington. But Governor Ferguson at this point hasn't opted us in. So then what would happen is you can still get the $1,700, yeah, as she mentioned, the $1,700, credit deduction on your federal income tax. But then other states that have opted into this program, not Washington, are going to be the beneficiaries of that. Governor Ferguson has until January 1st to make a decision. Today, for the I don't know how many times, I reached out again to the office of Governor Ferguson and asked, have you made a decision? What's weighing into your decision? When will you? What are your holdups on opting us in? And I received no response from his office today. But back in January, Representative Michael Keaton offered a House joint memorial urging majority Democrats during the session to support the federal tax credit for education. And at the time, it came up in a media veil where I asked Representative Monica Stonier, are you going to chat with Rep. Keaton? She sits on top of a committee that he's in that would have considered this House joint memorial. At the time, she said, I don't think that we're probably going to get to it. In fact, I want to read you her quote because she said, a measure like this doesn't have a lot of impact policy wise or provide much direction. We call them letters to Santa Claus, referring to the fact that House joint memorials sometimes do, often don't get a lot of attention. It's kind of seen as a last ditch effort. If you know your bill is not going to get the attention of a committee chair, maybe you offer this up in hopes of saying, pretty please, can we consider this? It was not considered. And in that same media veil, I asked Senator Jamie Peterson, sponsor of the income tax, why aren't we getting in on this? And I suggested to him, well, it's not just public schools aren't just going to get all their money yanked from them. In fact, many people might decide, well, I love my local public school. I want my tax credit to go there, or I want it to go to tutors for those kids, or a particular program, or charter schools, or transportation, or school uniforms. It's really anything. And he pushed back, and Senator Peterson said, no, this is a giant diversion of resources out of the public schools. Based on how I've read how the system works, that's an inaccurate statement that he made. But I guess that's, remains to be seen whether or not the governor's going to opt us in. You'll still have the opportunity to direct those tax dollars, even into other states. You can say, I want my money to go to, whichever thus and such state or programs in other states that have opted in. But boy, wouldn't it be great to have those dollars stay here in Washington? All right, that is it for this Friday episode of Washington in Focus Daily. Thank you for watching. I really appreciate it. We're going to be watching through the weekend to see if Governor Ferguson signs that income tax bill into law. As soon as he does, I'm guessing shortly thereafter, we're going to have a legal challenge announced where that's coming from. It's going to be interesting to wait and watch. And I promise we're staying as much on top of it as we can. I hope you have a great weekend.